Hello, citizens, and here we go again. This is Histories and Mysteries Redux, Genesis Part 1, the class about creationism. And yes, you're stuck with me, that guy again, Bill Burris. What is Redux? These are Histories and Mystery classes that I've done in the past, taught at the church, and I've changed them, reformatted a little bit, make them a little more friendly for online, and then I've recorded them, and I've put them out here. There are two in this group, both on creation. So, Histories and Mysteries, Redux, Genesis, Part 1 and Part 2. This is Part 1. So, let's pretend it's Sunday morning. Grab your caffeinated beverage of choice. Pretend it's Woody's Fair Trade Blend. That's pretty good, Joe. Take a seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion. Look to the whiteboard on the left-hand side of the class. That's where the terrible dumb joke is usually written down. There it is on the bottom of the screen here. Yeah. Yeah, that one is really bad. Okay, this is a Christian education event, so we have to have some passages. We're talking about creation. So here we go. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the life of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And for a second passage, Isaiah 45, verse 18. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens. He is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it a chaos. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, there is no other. So, the much dreaded agenda for our class, we're going to do the opening prayer, some caveats and disclaimers. Then we're going to talk at least very briefly about Genesis as mythology. Then we're going to get into the main topic, which is creationism, science, and some conclusions and stuff to wrap this particular episode up. So, the opening prayer, if you know it, say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. Caveats and disclaimers. Got to turn on that super fast voice, the one on the radio. The goofball is pretending to be a Sunday school teacher, is a geologist, and therefore prone to make fun of creationism. You should not let him get away with this, as creationism is a perfectly reasonable and valid belief system that forms the foundation of three of the world's major religions. Creation science, on the other hand, is fair game. All right, further caveats. The opinions that I'm going to be discussing here are mine, Bill, and I'm a scientist, a geologist, in fact. And I even got a piece of paper from the government that says so. So it must be true, right? Everything the government says is correct. All right, to give you a sense of where I'm coming from here, there were two questions on my final exam, or the first two questions on my final exam from Geology 101. Question number 1, what is geology? Geology is the science of the Earth. Question number 2, how old is the Earth? The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That'll give you a sense of where my academic understanding is and background is when you start talking about creationism. So, right off the bat, there is going to be geology. I know, it makes you all sad. I can understand the disappointment. Wherever there's geology, there are bad puns. And again, you just have to, one goes with the other. Nothing you can do about it. Okay, the most fearful schedule. This is what we're doing this week and the next class. So this week we're talking about creation and creationism, and next week we're talking about creation or dominion over the earth, or think about it as the class about taking care of creation or sustainability. After that, well, I'm not sure what's happening after that. Let's look at least the concept of Genesis as mythology. Every society, especially literate societies where we have records that go back to the past, have some form of mythology that explains kind of everything from the origin of the universe to the planet to their own civilization and society. For example, we even have records of the mythology of Native Americans that have been orally transmitted from days of yore and were eventually written down. For example, the Great Bear, who tried to climb up the side of Devil's Tower and caused the furrows, the scratches down the side of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. That's a mythology used by Native Americans to explain the formation of the sides of Devil's Tower. So some people look at Genesis, especially the creation stories in the first parts of Genesis, as being Hebrew mythology. This is the mythological portion of the Bible and should be treated as such. But even if it is, and I'm not saying it is, well, that's up to you to decide, but one way or the other, even if it is mythology, there's analogies in mythology that are reached back to try to explain the way the world works. For example, when you're talking about Christ to Constantine in my previous classes, we talked about Roman traditional religion and how it reached back to mythology. Practitioners of Roman traditional religion did not necessarily believe word for word in Roman mythology. It was an analogy, a way of explaining the universe, but they didn't believe it literally. So for example, let's take a look at a potential analogy in Genesis, and that is the first murder of Cain and Abel, the two brothers, one who is the farmer and one who is the herder. Both present their offerings to God. One gets jealous of the other and then murders him. Could this potentially be an analogy for the cycle of warfare for the very first civilizations that existed in the Mesopotamian era? So, for example, the cycle would go like this. The people in the valley, the civilized people, would be the farmers. They are raising crops. In fact, one of the reasons and hallmarks of civilization is that you get a surplus of food. It takes fewer people to feed everybody. And as a result, you have surplus population, so people can do other things, like be priests or politicians, rulers, so on and so forth. And that allows a civilization to thrive and grow. Well, then you have the pastoralists, the people who raise goats, sheep, livestock out in the hills. And they look down on the folks in the river valley and go, look at those wimps down there. They're all cushy lifestyle, and they've got all kinds of stuff that we don't have. And so what happens is the pastoralists come roaring down in their chariots and raid and pillage and plunder and then take over. And then within a generation or two, they're the farmers. And another group of pastoralists sits on the hill and looks down and goes, those guys down there farming, they got all this stuff that we don't have, so on and so forth. And you kind of get this cycle, this wave of nomadic pastoralists coming in and conquering and taking over and then being integrated into the civilization and so on and so forth. This actually happened in China, where the Mongols took over China at one point of time, and then within 2 generations, it would have been almost impossible to tell the Mongol aristocracy from the previous Chinese aristocracy. So now we're getting into the topic of the day, which is creationism. What is creationism? Well, let's look straight from Wikipedia. Creationism is the religious belief that the universe and life originated from specific acts of divine creation. In other words, the universe and life were created directly by God. Some questions that are associated with creationism. How old is the universe? How old is the earth? Did humans evolve from monkeys? Where do fossils come from? What happened to the dinosaurs? I'm a scientist, and as a scientist, I like to categorize things and fit them into boxes, or try to fit them in boxes, even if they don't necessarily fit in those boxes. I'm darn going to try to squash them in. So here we go. This is a quasi-scientific characterization of creationists. You have young Earth creationists. Think of these as literal readers of the Bible. They argue that humanity was directly created by God, that there is no evolution of species. The Earth is less than 10,000 years old, and so is the universe. The Earth and universe were created at the same time. A variation of this is gap creationists that argue the same thing, except that they argue that the Earth can be 4.5 billion years old and the universe can be 13 billion years old, as is scientifically accepted, because the way time was measured could be different prior to the flood. Okay, what is a day to God? Maybe a day to God is billions of years. Progressive creationism argues that there was no great flood, that scientists are right about the age of the Earth, and scientists are right about the age of the universe, but humanity was still created directly by God. Intelligent design is the idea that God intervened or monkeyed with evolution, so that as a result, through divine intervention, we and all creation and life occurred. And so as a result, you can then argue that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and the universe is 13 billion years old. Intelligent design argues you can scientifically prove that there is divine intervention, because they argue that life has an irreducible complexity that could only be derived if you had an intelligence putting it all together. And then lastly, there's theistic evolution, which is the best way of saying is that it's kind of like guided evolution. God in the background kind of pushed and prodded and steered things. And the idea is that there's some sort of guidance to the way that creatures formed through evolution. So let's talk about the scientific understanding of the origin and age of the universe. Scientists says the universe is roughly 13 billion years old. Now, if you take the physics as we understand it and the math associated with that physics as we understand it and distill it down and then take it to its logical conclusion, then it appears that the entire universe formed at a single event, which we call the Big Bang. And as a result of this, the idea that the entire universe formed from essentially nothing 13 billion years ago, many religions and creationists they're on board with this. This fits right in with the idea that God created the universe, that some intelligence flipped a switch and bang, the universe formed. Scientific evidence indicates that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, give or take a few million years. This is based on radioisotope dating, specifically out of tiny little crystals called zircons. And they use uranium lead isotope and argon isotope dating as a way to try to backtrack and figure out when those tiny little crystals were actually formed. Based on the evidence that is generated so far, that we've seen so far, life, the earliest life on Earth is maybe 4.2 billion years ago. There was an event we believe occurred roughly about 4 billion years ago that we call the iron catastrophe. The idea is that the Earth is accumulated of debris, asteroids, all the stuff clumped together to form the Earth, and then as radiation within the minerals decayed, it heated it all up, and eventually it reached a point where this mass of rock and stuff got so hot that all the iron melted and flooded to the center of the Earth, becoming the Earth's core that we have there now, a mix of iron and nickel, a solid mass of iron and nickel. It's formed the Earth's core. And we think that maybe that event, we call it the iron catastrophe, occurred roughly 4 billion years ago. 2.3 billion years ago, you can start seeing a certain change in the rocks that indicate the great oxygenation event. The idea that you're starting to actually get free oxygen in the atmosphere. The argument goes that there was no free oxygen in the atmosphere. There was lots of carbon dioxide. But as life evolved, photosynthesis evolved, little tiny grubby bacteria, algae, things like that could photosynthesize and transform the carbon dioxide, capture the carbon and use it for their life processes and release the oxygen. Eventually you would get so much oxygen being released by these life processes that you'd have free oxygen. And we see this in the rock record because you start to actually get rust. Rocks with rust in them, iron oxide. Okay, multicellular life is believed to have started roughly around 1.5 billion years ago. And then an event, if you want to call it an event, suddenly there's an eruption, an effusion, a change in life. There's just all kinds of multicellular life that just seem to emerge suddenly, roughly around 540 million years ago. We call this the Cambrian explosion. We call this particular chunk of the Earth's history the Cambrian. It's named after a part of England, Cambria, and we start to find for the first time in these rocks that are roughly 540 million years ago this proliferation of multicellular life, trilobites and shellfish and all kinds of interesting and odd different creatures that just weren't there prior to this time. So, some fundamentals here about evolution. Evolution as a biological process is fact. You cannot get away from it. Even the most hardened creationist, the most ardent creationist has to agree that evolution is occurring in our time, and the greatest evidence for that is antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Natural selection in action. You have a colony of bacteria, you hit it with antibiotics. Some of that bacteria are resistant, they live, they propagate, make more resistant bacteria, and the next thing you know, antibiotics aren't as effective as they used to be. You can't get away from this. It's happening right now. So creationists don't deny that evolution is occurring now and at this scale, but they refer to this process as microevolution, and they argue that macroevolution, the evolution from one species to another, does not exist or has not existed, that the species were directly created by God. All right. So where did humans come from? One of the great misunderstood concepts about evolution is the idea that humans evolved from monkeys. And I did never evolve from a monkey. It's the mantra of the creationist. In truth, if you looked into the way that evolution works, the concept isn't that humans evolved from monkeys. The concept is that humans and monkeys and gorillas and all primates evolved from some single species. And then we branched off in diverse paths. So we didn't evolve from monkeys. Humans and monkeys evolved from some type of primate in the past. Now, where do fossils come from? So I can argue and tell you all about it. When I took paleontology back in school, I had classes on the formation of fossils. You know, stuff gets buried in sediments. On a whole, the organic compounds tend to decay, but maybe the hard stuff like the shells of the bones stay, so on and so forth. And maybe they form molds, all kinds of things. Boring stuff. We don't want to get into all of the nuances of how fossils are formed. But fossils create a problem for creationists. So, for example, if you went to the Beartooth Mountains in Montana, just north of Yellowstone, there is a butte there called Beartooth Butte. and eroding out of the side of this butte, which is roughly 9,000 feet above sea level, are fish fossils from the Devonian age, just rotting right out of the side of the hill. Littering the ground are little bits and bones and plates and scales from fish. And if you look at Beartooth Butte, here's a funny little lens of light-colored material there. It looks like it was a channel or a river that got filled up, and these critters died in that river and became fossils. So if you're a creationist, you need to somehow explain, how did fossils get on a mountaintop? And so the creationist explanation for fossils is that they got there because of the flood. The other argument, and I thought this was an old argument that has since been disgraced and nobody ever uses it anymore, but when I was teaching as a teaching assistant in graduate school, and I discussed this argument of seeds as this early idea of where fossils came from, somebody actually said, no, that's what they taught me in their church. So somebody out there is still teaching this stuff. The idea of seeds, that God scatters seeds of life out into the world. And a lot of these seeds fall where they need to fall for the creature to survive, and other seeds don't. And as a result, they fall down into the rock. They get into the rock somehow, and then a shellfish emerges from the seed, and then the shellfish has nothing to eat, so it dies. But it leaves its fossil behind. So somehow the universe got seeded by God. This is another explanation of how fossils got there, as opposed to a geologist explanation where Beartooth Butte is Devonian sediments that were once lower on the ground, lower in elevation, that there was a river running through the rock, fish were in the river, something happened to the river, it got filled up with sediment, the fish formed fossils, and then during the Laramide mountain building event, a giant thrust fault thrust all of this rock up into the air, and hence 9,000 feet. And we argue as a result that this kind of process has taken an enormous amount of time. Where do dinosaurs come from? And more importantly, where did they go? So you can't argue that there was no such thing as dinosaurs, because we find their bones all over the place. So science says that dinosaurs evolved roughly 200 plus million years ago, and then they were wiped out by a bolide impact, a comet, a meteor, wiped them out 66 million years ago. Creationists argue that dinosaurs were created by the devil before the flood. And the reason why dinosaurs are funny looking is because the devil was trying to be like God and create life like God, but God said all wrong. So that's why dinosaurs look odd, because the devil couldn't make life like God makes life. And as a result, you get dinosaurs with funky sails because the devil just didn't know how to make life. Tyrannosaurus Rex has little tiny arms because the devil doesn't know how to properly make arms or legs for dinosaurs. If some dinosaur looks like a frog combined with a lizard, then that's the devil's work. So that's one potential argument that have been put forth by creationists to explain dinosaurs, that they weren't created by God, that they were a failed experiment of the devil created prior to the flood. Others argue that they were created by God, it's just that they missed the boat during the flood. And then others still, if you saw my presentation, Looking for Leakers, my Histories and Mysteries Redux interlude episode, that's on YouTube right now. Some argue that they were actually on the boat and that they went extinct at a later time. Now let's talk at least briefly about intelligent design. This is an attempt to insert God into science classrooms. It argues that life is so complex that it has some form of irreducible complexity, that it could only have been created by an intelligence, which leads to the concept of guided evolution. And this is one way that many people try to deal with the concept of God and science, is the idea that, well, God's in control, so God must have been guiding evolution. As a religious belief system, this is okay. There's nothing wrong with thinking that. As a scientific system, it's terrible. It's very bad science. So here's my little cartoon. So much for today's biology lesson on intelligent design. Turning now to the subject of intelligent geography. Intelligent design, intersecting, adding the supernatural to science, natural science. It's just bad science. And so this is an attempt, intelligence design is viewed as an attempt to intersect or somehow insert God into the classroom. Now there are gaps in the science. So if we're looking at the opposite way, instead of criticizing creationism, let's criticize science. There's gaps in the science. For example, the origin of life. Science has yet to adequately explain the origin of life. There have been experiments done where you can build the building blocks of life out of, you take gunk and goo and you put it in a jar and you hit it with electricity and boom, you got simple amino acids. But you don't have any mechanism. There's no real proof or understanding on how you got those amino acids into proteins and those proteins into life. You got some theories, but that's all they are. There's no real evidence to support any of it. The other thing that's missing in most cases are missing links or transition fossils. The idea that if you had one type of species and over time it evolved into another type of species, there should be a fossil or a kind of species that mixes the traits of both. Now, there's some instances in the fossil record where we can find some transition fossils, but in most cases we don't. And this is because it's actually really hard to become a fossil. You have to work hard to become a fossil. If you want to get fossilized, you've got to die someplace where your bits and pieces are going to get preserved in the rock record. And so, to actually get yourself in a swamp deposit and then buried in an anoxic environment and then squashed down and then in the rock record, it's hard to do. So there's millions and millions and billions of fossils out there, but they're just a tiny fraction, a poor representation of the actual life that used to occur and has lived throughout the history of the earth. And so in that sense, it's not all that surprising that we're missing transition fossils, but it still stands out that if you're looking for gaps in the science, we're missing transition fossils for many steps in evolution. Now let's take it and flip it over on its head. The whole concept of, finding gaps in the science, let's try to take science and use it to support creationism. That's creation science. Okay, this also, like intelligent design, is bad science. The idea is to take and use science to explain how the events in the Bible occurred. So, for example, if you're arguing that the Bible is the truth, and then you had a flood, then you can try to use that flood explanation. There is a worldwide flood at Noah occurred. The water, how did all that water show up? Well, the water was trapped in layers of the rock. And as an event occurred that squeezed the water out of that rock, continents moved back and forth. Everything shifted to the current shape they are now. The continents actually split apart during the flood. That's why Africa and South America and Europe and America fit so snugly together if you put them to do. We're not arguing as creation scientists that the continents didn't form one major continent and then break apart. We just argue that it had occurred during this flood event. It's this kind of muggy, goofy science. The thing is what you're doing is instead of looking at the evidence, here, we'll get to the next slide. Instead of looking at the evidence and then reaching your conclusions based on the evidence, you're taking your conclusion and then trying to find evidence to support it, which can be, well, that's bad science. Creationists often look at anomalies. These are things that cannot be easily explained or can't be explained by science as a way to disprove the conventional scientific understanding of the Earth's history. Ways of breaking our understanding of the rock record. Kind of like, well, if that's the case, then how do you explain this? Now, some of these anomalies are just outright hoaxes, such as the dinosaur saddle. Others, like the Paluxy River deposits, where you have a fossil bed that contains dinosaur footprints and what at first glance appears to be human footprints in the same sedimentary bed. In other words, it looks like humans walked with dinosaurs. That can't be, that's not conventional science. Humans evolved or started to evolve over the last few 100,000 years. Dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago. There's no way that humans could have walked with dinosaurs. And looking at these fossils or these footprints, well, they look human. They're really big. Humans, they're giants, as a matter of fact, but then you could have giants before the flood. So the argument goes. However, if you actually look closely at the human type footprints, it becomes very clear that they have 3 toes and claws, and that what initially looks like human footprints are on much closer inspection, also obviously another species of dinosaur. There is, however, one anomaly that is really, really challenging for geologists to come up with an explanation for. A place where the rock record appears to be incorrect or wrong. And I was just blown away when somebody showed me this and then tried to explain a scientific explanation as to how this anomaly occurred. And I'm just like, this is the best you can come up with? So let's go over this anomaly here. This anomaly is Hart Mountain, Wyoming. So here we are in Wyoming. Here's Cody, Wyoming, right down here. This is the Bighorn Basin north of Cody, right here. And then we have Hart Mountain. It's a lone mountain sitting up on the southern part of the Bighorn Basin. And to the west, we have the Absaroka Range, that Beartooth Butte that I mentioned, Beartooth Mountains. Yellowstone is to the west here. Grand Tetons are down to the south here. So get yourself kind of centered. We're in Wyoming, near Yellowstone, just east of Yellowstone, in the Bighorn Basin, and here's Hart Mountain. Now, Hart Mountain is a lone mountain sitting out here in the Bighorn Basin, and it consists of 300 million year old limestone and dolomite. And there's no arguing about it. That's what it is. If you're going to use conventional geologic science and you look at that rock, you go, this is 300 million year old stuff. The fossils are 300 million years old. It matches the other limestones that are to the west of us as being 300 million years old. This is Mississippian aged, 300 million year old limestone and dolomite. And it's sitting directly on top of 55 million year old Eocene aged gravel. Now, this is normally a problem because you're not supposed to have old rock on top of young rock. It's kind of like the papers in your office. Okay, when you lay down papers in your office, The ones on the top are the ones that you laid down last. They're younger deposits than the stuff at the bottom of the pile. We call this as geologists the law of superposition. Older rocks are on the bottom, younger rocks are on the top. Now we have many instances throughout the rock record where you have older rock on top of younger rock. But you have to get an explanation as to why that occurred. Often it's a result of folding. The entire sequence of rocks gets flipped over in a fold. That can often occur. Faulting is another obvious solution where the older rock gets thrust up on a fault on top of the younger rock. So in Heart Mountain, obviously, there's no real big folding event here that occurred 55 million years ago. These gravels were deposited out in the Bighorn Basin 55 million years ago, and no major folding has occurred since. So something must have occurred to thrust this much younger rock on top of this older rock. However, when you looked at the contact, the place where the older rock sits on top of the younger rock, the contact, there's no foobar there. Okay, I used a big scientific word there. Real specific, very, well, okay. Foobar is kind of a military term. Comes from the same thing as snafu, but geologists use it for the type of rock that you get in fault zones. The F is, well, okay, and then the U is up, the B is beyond, A is all, and the R is recognition, up beyond all recognition. F, okay, you can follow along. Foobar. There's no foobar here. There's no evidence of smearing or faulting. It's just sitting right there on top of the gravel. How did it get there? So let's again take a look at our little map here. Here's Heart Mountain. You can see here it is, this clump of limestone here. And you can actually match up that limestone to a limestone in this area up here and in this area up here. And then that limestone must have somehow traveled from up here, broken off, and then slid down the side of the mountain to its current position. But that doesn't make any sense because we don't see any foobar. There's no evidence of faulting. So now you have to ask a geologist, how did this occur? Explain this to me. This is an anomaly. So we come to the famous beer can experiment. The famous beer can experiment. This was explained to me, or presented to me as the explanation for why Heart Mountain got to where it is. Okay, so let's go over the famous beer can experiment. First of all, you have to have at least 2 geologists. It's no fun with just one geologist because then you're drinking alone. Now, for the experiment to work, you have to drink vast quantities of beer. This helps with the validity of the experiment and makes it a lot more fun. Okay, so huge amount of beer, you drink it, and then you put a bunch of the empty cans in the freezer. Then you take a plane of glass, and you set up that plane of glass, and then you put an empty beer can on the plane of glass, and then you tilt the plane of glass until it comes up to around 15, 20 degrees, and then suddenly the beer can will start to slide down the pane of glass. The force of gravity overcomes the force of friction, and it slowly slides down the pane of glass. Well, the problem with Heart Mountain is, like the beer can, is that the plane it must have slid to have gotten where it is not 15, 20 degrees. It's only 1 or 2 degrees at the most over the distance, because we're talking miles here. Okay, presumably Heart Mountain wasn't just a clump of limestone when it occurred. It was a giant sheet of limestone, and all we have now are the erosional remnants after 55 or 50 or how many ever million years. All we got left is this clump of rock, but still it's traveled miles and miles without actually leaving a mark, no foobar, no evidence of grinding. So how did it get here? So the idea is that you then take one of these cans of beer from the freezer and you put it top down, this empty beer can, on the glass, and the pane of glass is then only at 1 degree, maybe 2, in terms of inclination. And what happens is as the beer can heats up, the air inside the beer can expands, and then suddenly you've eliminated the friction because you've got a tiny little cushion of air underneath the can of beer, and whee! The beer can slides right off the pane of glass. This is the famous beer can experiment, and it works, especially if you've consumed enough beer. So the idea is that during the Absaroka volcanic event, somehow volcanic gases got up underneath this giant sheet of limestone, and it floated miles, broke off and floated miles down on this cushion of hot volcanic gas, and then came to rest miles away, and then eroded away into Heart Mountain and also Sheep Mountain to the south. And that's the best that geologists can come up with, and I think it's kind of lame, but all right, well, anyway, moving on. Okay, here's the other alternative for trying to reconcile science and creationism, and that is simply to say God created the earth 10,000 million years, or 10,000 years ago, or less than 10,000 years ago. When God created the earth, he just created an earth that was 4.5 billion years old. And there's nothing a scientist can argue about that, because God created it, and we got all the evidence, and so on and so forth. But that's that's an issue of religion. It is not an issue of science. So, all right. So now we get into my opinion. This is strictly my opinion. Creationism is a religious belief system. It is grounded in faith. And as such, it is perfectly legitimate as an expression of your faith, your understanding of your world, as part of your religious faith, to believe in creationism. But that is not science. That is religion. Science is science. And for science to work properly, you have to eliminate from it the supernatural. You're looking for natural explanations for how the world got to where it is. And so as soon as you start mixing faith into science via creation science or intelligent design, you're wrecking the science. And so I have no problem with people who believe in creationism as a religious system, but I have a tremendous problem who are taking aspects of creationism and intelligent design and trying to put it into the science classroom, because then you're teaching bad science. So let's wrap this all up with some kind of conclusion. What does a Christian believe? What is a Christian supposed to believe? Well, let's look at John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, and whosoever believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Okay, God so loved the world. God so loved creation. He loved creation so much that he gave his only Son. That's a heck of a sacrifice. So that we, as part of creation, are very important. So important that God would actually offer that sacrifice to us. So at least that's what I argue. It's irrelevant to a certain extent how the earth got here. Believe that it's there, it's important, and important enough for Jesus to have been brought forth as part of it. So, we argue as Christians that the Hebrew Testament is a record of God's plan. The Israelites were chosen by God to bring forth the Messiah for the redemption of all mankind. The Hebrew Testament is the story of the unfolding of that plan, the history of the Israelites, Jesus' history, if you will, and this includes Genesis. And it doesn't matter if you consider Genesis to be just fact or if you consider it to be a myth, it's almost irrelevant. Okay, creation was put there as part of the plan leading to Christ. Which leads us to the logic here. We are important. The presence of Christ proves it. Creation is important. The earth was created for us. So maybe if creation is important and we're important and we need creation, then maybe we should take care of creation. Which leads to my next class, Genesis and environmentalism, sustainability, stuff like that, taking care of creation and the biblical terminology or the biblical support of environmentalism. So that's what I'm going to talk about next time. Until then, here's a picture of a kitten and a flower. All right, everybody, take care. Give us feedback. Let us know what you're thinking about these. If you have any particular topics that you want me to address, let me know, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate. Thanks for listening, and we greatly appreciate it.